A couple of years back, my best friend and I decided we were overdue for another camping trip. We're the type who'd rather be out in the woods than sitting at home, so we usually manage a few trips every month, even in less than ideal conditions. Late November rolled around, and Virginia was already in one of those cold, damp moods it gets that time of year. Normally it would have just been the two of us roughing it, but this time our girlfriends surprised us by saying they actually wanted to come along. We joked about how most of our trips are miserable by normal standards. Mud, cold nights, no cell service, and that maybe they'd change their minds. But they didn't. So we packed up and planned a quick weekend away in the mountains. By the time Saturday evening came, the four of us were in the car heading a couple of hours west. The further we drove, the colder it got, and eventually rain started hammering down. My girlfriend shifted nervously in her seat, and I could tell she was second-guessing the idea of camping in freezing rain. My buddy and I, being used to this kind of thing, told them it was fine, and we'd be warm soon enough once the fire was going. The spot we were heading to wasn't marked on any map. It was this overlook on the side of a mountain, with a steep hidden trail dropping down behind the rocks. You weren't supposed to camp there, but we'd been using that place for years. It was our little hideaway, just far enough off the beaten path that nobody ever stumbled across us. When we pulled up, though, night had already swallowed everything around us. You could see the city lights faintly in the distance, but the mountains themselves were just a wall of shadow. The rain hadn't let up, and the wind felt like it was slicing through every layer of clothing we had on. I unloaded my pack with my girlfriend and walked over to the start of the trail, figuring my buddy and his girlfriend were right behind us. After a couple of minutes, I realized they weren't coming. When I walked back to check, I found them standing by the car bickering. My buddy had somehow locked the keys inside. Now it's pouring rain, it's freezing, it's almost 10 at night, and we've got no way to call for help. The nearest town was at least 20 miles away, and our phones were useless out here. My girlfriend has a joint problem that flares up in the cold, and I could see how much she was struggling. I decided the best thing I could do was at least get her down to the bottom of the trail where we usually set up, so she could warm up by a fire while the others figured out the car situation. So we started making our way down. That descent is never easy even in daylight, but doing it in the dark with rain and fog felt like trying to walk down an ice-covered ladder. Our headlamps only made it harder because the mist just reflected the light right back into our eyes. We took turns, one of us carrying both sets of packs, while the other climbed down a few feet at a time, then handing gear back and forth. It was slow, careful progress, but we were moving. After about 20 minutes, we were close to the bottom when my girlfriend suddenly froze and said, "Do you see that?" I squinted through the fog and caught sight of a tarp spread out across the rocks below. At first, I thought we had lucked out, that someone had dropped it and we just scored a free piece of gear. I started working my way toward it, but then I noticed a grocery store basket sitting nearby. It looked like it was filled with snack wrappers. That stopped me cold, because there shouldn't have been any reason for something like that to be out here. My girlfriend whispered, her voice cracking, that it looked like someone might actually be lying under the tarp. I brushed it off, trying to convince both of us that no one could possibly be sleeping out here in these conditions. No tent, no fire, no car parked up top. It didn't make any sense. This wasn't the kind of place a thru hiker or anyone homeless could survive, not in this weather, and not miles away from civilization. I told myself it had to be the wind tugging at the tarp. But then, as my headlamp swept across it, the tarp shifted. And then it shifted again. Not the wind. Someone was moving underneath it. My stomach dropped, and before I could even whisper a plan, my girlfriend bolted up the slope as fast as the rocks would let her. I turned my light off, crouched low, and just listened. I could hear whoever it was down there stirring, rocks crunching under their movements, slow but deliberate. I called out, trying to convince myself it might be someone lost or hurt. "Hey, do you need help?" The silence that followed was heavier than the rain. I tried again, nothing. Whoever it was had no interest in answering. That was all I needed to hear. I scrambled back up after my girlfriend, heart pounding. When we made it back to the car, she was in tears and I couldn't stop pacing. My buddy and his girlfriend were rattled after we told them what had happened. Now we weren't just stuck with a locked car. We had no idea who was down there or what they were doing. Eventually, he managed to get enough cell service to call a locksmith. The guy showed up after what felt like hours and immediately told us we should leave the area. He mentioned that strange things happen in those mountains, from hikers vanishing to bodies turning up. He didn't go into detail, but his point was clear. Nobody slept that night. We piled into the car once it was unlocked and drove all the way home in silence. I still catch myself replaying that moment when the tarp moved. What was that person doing there in the middle of nowhere, in the freezing rain with no gear? Why stay silent when someone offered help? I'll never know, but the memory still makes my skin crawl. Back when I was 13, my world revolved around a handful of really close friends. There were 5 of us in the group: me, Rose, Lynn, Zach, and Noah. We did everything together, from weekend road trips to late-night beach outings, and we all had this restless energy that made us think we were braver than we actually were. Noah's family had money, and with parents who weren't overly strict, we were constantly testing boundaries. That summer before 8th grade, we decided camping would be our next big adventure. The plan was to head out with Lynn's older sister Margot and Zach's older brother Todd, both of whom were 17. That gave us 7 people total, which seemed like the perfect number to pull off something exciting without any adult chaperones. We picked a forest about 20 miles from Noah's house, far enough to feel like we were really out there, but still close enough that it didn't feel impossible to get home if things went sideways. At least that's what we thought. Setting up camp was simple enough. We split into a girls' tent and a boys' tent, swam in a lake nearby, made dinner, and settled into that cliché camping routine of telling stories and roasting marshmallows. At some point, Margot stomped back from the girls' tent looking annoyed. She said someone kept brushing up against the side of their tent, dragging something along the fabric. None of us had left the fire, so it didn't make sense. Todd brushed it off, saying it was probably branches moving in the wind. Eventually, I went to bed with Rose and Margot, while Lynn was already passed out in the corner of the tent. I must have been asleep for only an hour or 2 before I woke up for no reason. The woods were dead quiet, but then I caught it. A faint tapping against the side of the tent, followed by this strange giggling. It wasn't the laugh of a kid. It was deeper, rougher, like a grown man trying to hold it back. I froze for a moment, convinced maybe I was hearing things, but the sound went on long enough to be real. I told myself it was just a branch scraping, or one of the guys screwing around, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, we split into 2 groups. Margot, Lynn, Rose, and I went hiking, while the guys decided to stay back and fish. When we returned hours later, the campsite was eerily empty. Margot and Lynn went down to the lake to look for them, while Rose and I checked the tents. That's when my stomach dropped. Both tents had long, deliberate slashes in them, like someone had taken a knife to the fabric. Rose screamed, and when I looked closer, I could see how clean the cuts were. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't kids messing around. The others came running when they heard us yelling, but things went from bad to worse when Todd noticed his tires had been slashed too. With no cell service and only one other vehicle, we were stuck. Margot's car still worked, but it couldn't fit all of us with the gear inside. The plan was for her to drive Noah and Lynn back to town to get help, while the rest of us, Todd, Zach, Rose, and me, waited. None of us wanted to linger near the vandalized campsite, so we started walking toward the main road to make the pickup easier. About half an hour into the hike, I kept noticing sounds behind us, branches snapping in rhythm with our pace. I told Todd, and he started scanning the trees more carefully. Then, out of nowhere, he shouted for us to run. I looked back just long enough to see 3 massive figures charging toward us from the woods. They were tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark hoodies and masks that hid their faces. 2 of them were carrying knives, glinting in the daylight. We bolted. The sound of them crashing through the underbrush behind us was terrifying, and every step felt like we were seconds from being caught. By some miracle, we managed to outpace them. Eventually, the pursuit stopped, and when we glanced back, the men were gone. We didn't slow down until we reached the road, where Margot finally pulled up in her car. Later, when the police searched the area, they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone else being there besides our torn-up tents. We showed them pictures we'd taken at the lake, but it wasn't enough to prove what had happened. The whole experience left me with an uneasy realization. Sometimes people are more dangerous than the wilderness itself. Last summer was supposed to be this big send-off trip before all of us scattered for college. We'd been talking about it since senior year ended. One last time where it was just us, no parents, no responsibilities, just a little slice of freedom. Looking back, I wish we'd gone somewhere safer, but we were 17 and thought we were invincible. There were 6 of us, me and my girlfriend Stephanie, my buddy Brandon, and his girlfriend Kaylee, plus Steve and his girlfriend Sarah. Each couple had their own tent, and between the 6 of us, we had way more supplies than we actually needed. I was the Boy Scout of the group, so I made sure we had food, water, lanterns, the works. But we also showed up with coolers full of beer and a bag full of weed, because that's what we cared about more than anything. The drive out felt endless. We spent hours on back roads until we found a spot that looked perfect. Quiet woods with a few houses in the distance, but not so close that anyone would bother us. There was no cell service, which was annoying at first, but after a while we just shrugged it off. We set up camp, parked Steve's Honda Pilot close enough to keep an eye on it, and spent the first night exactly how you'd imagine, passing around a blunt, cracking open beers, laughing until we fell asleep in our tents. The next day we wanted to see what else was around, so me, Steve, and Sarah went wandering while Brandon and Kaylee stayed behind to do their own thing. We followed a trail not far from camp, and after 20 minutes, we stumbled on this old cemetery. It wasn't abandoned, though. There were flowers on some of the graves, little notes tucked into the headstones. It looked like people still came by to visit. Just past it, we noticed a wider dirt path with faint tire marks and a rough parking area, like something you'd see for a hiking spot. We didn't linger long. We spotted some deer, joked around a little, and eventually headed back. That evening we went harder than the night before, figuring we should burn through what we brought so we wouldn't have to haul it home. We drank, smoked, told stupid stories, and when we finally crawled into our tents, I thought we'd all just crash until morning. Instead, everything flipped upside down in seconds. I shot awake to Sarah's scream ripping through the campsite. Steve's tent was being slashed open from the outside, fabric tearing like paper. Steve swung his heavy flashlight at whoever it was and managed to fight him off long enough to get himself and Sarah into the car. They had the best shot since their tent was closest to it. The rest of us weren't so lucky. Our tents were set up farther back, closer to the tree line. I remember Stephanie clinging to my arm while Brandon and Kaylee scrambled out of theirs. Then Steve's voice cut through the chaos. He yelled, "Cemetery!" That's when it clicked. The trail past the cemetery was our only other way out, and if we could get there, maybe Steve could circle back. I grabbed Stephanie's hand, and the 4 of us sprinted into the woods. My phone light was the only thing guiding us, and yeah, it probably made us easier to spot. But the idea of missing that trail and ending up lost in the dark was worse. I could hear the guy behind us, crashing through the brush, not close enough to grab us, but close enough that every step felt like a countdown. We reached the cemetery and scrambled over the fence, huddling among the graves. I killed the light, and instantly the world went black. The silence was deafening except for the sound of my heart pounding. Then I heard it, the rattle of the fence as he climbed over. He'd followed us. His footsteps on the gravel were deliberate, slow, like he knew we were nearby and wanted us to hear him coming. That's when I remembered the pocket knife I always carried. Small, nothing special, but it was something. As his steps drew closer, I waited until I could practically feel him over me, and then I drove the knife into the back of his leg. He let out this awful scream and collapsed, dropping whatever weapon he had been holding. When it hit the ground, I realized it was a machete. The The timing couldn't have been better. Steve's headlights cut through the trees as he pulled back around. We bolted from our hiding spots and sprinted for the car. I was the last one in, and as the light hit the guy, I caught a glimpse of him. Tall, broad shoulders, his face twisted with fury as he clutched his bleeding leg. That machete glinted beside him as Steve hit the gas and we sped off. The ride was a blur of sobbing, swearing, and heavy breathing. None of us knew what to say, so we didn't. We drove until we found the first house with a light on, and knocked like maniacs until an older couple answered. They didn't even ask questions, just ushered us in, gave us food, and offered their spare rooms. The next morning, the old man came with us, carrying his rifle, to grab what was left of our gear. The tents were shredded, but nothing was stolen. His wife had called the police while we were gone, and by the time we got back, officers were waiting. We gave our statements, but there wasn't much evidence for them to work with. We headed home later that day, quiet the whole ride back. None of us wanted to think about what had just happened, and even now, a year later, it rarely comes up when we talk. It feels like one of those things everyone wants to bury. I don't blame them. When I was a teenager, my summers almost always included camping trips with my family. We'd head out to White Lake State Park in New Hampshire, and it was the kind of place that made childhood feel like a movie. Days full of water balloon fights, rollerblades tearing down the paved paths, flashlight tag that went on until someone twisted an ankle, and cousins screaming at each other during Nerf battles. Those trips were the highlight of my year. Things changed when I got older, especially after my grandmother passed away. The big family gatherings slowed down and eventually stopped altogether. But there's one trip, one of the last ones we did, that's been burned into my memory for reasons I wish weren't so terrifying. I was 16 at the time. One night, while everyone was hanging out around the fire roasting marshmallows, my old prepaid track phone buzzed. It was a missed call from a friend. Since the campfire was loud and I wanted some privacy, I wandered off toward the edge of the campground. There was a narrow trail that ran past some empty sites, and I figured I'd just sit at one of the picnic tables where it was quiet. That part of the campground was deserted, and the only light came faintly from the bathrooms way up on the hill behind me. I dialed my friend back and we talked for a while, maybe 20 minutes, when I noticed movement on the road ahead. At first, it was just a dark outline slowly making its way down the road. It wasn't unusual to see campers going for a night stroll, so I didn't think much of it. But as the figure got closer, I realized the man didn't have a flashlight. Everyone brought one out at night, so that stood out immediately. I kept chatting into the phone, pretending not to notice, but I couldn't stop watching him. When he finally came close enough, I could make out his shape better. Tall, kind of heavy, with a light jacket hanging open. He looked like he was in his 30s or 40s. And then he stopped. Just stood there in the road, facing my campsite. I wasn't sure if he could tell I saw him, but we were locked into this weird silent standoff. I stopped listening to my friend completely and just stared back. Then he moved again. Only this time, it wasn't the casual pace of someone walking their dog or taking a stroll. He leaned forward slightly and started creeping toward me. Slow, careful steps, one after the other, like he didn't want me to hear him. The way he shifted his weight made it look like he was getting ready to lunge. That's when panic finally broke through. I jumped up from the picnic table and sprinted toward the trail that led back to my family's site. The sound of his footsteps came right after mine, fast, heavy, crushing leaves and snapping twigs. He was chasing me, no question. I tore down the path, branches whipping past my face, and then I heard him stumble. A branch cracked loudly, and he let out this grunt like he'd either tripped or slammed into something. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see his face. I just wanted distance between me and him. I kept running until the glow of our fire came into view. When I burst back into camp, I was a mess, crying, shaking, trying to explain what had just happened. My family listened, but instead of being alarmed, they brushed it off. My aunt suggested maybe it was some guy who thought I was someone else and was messing around. My cousin laughed and said the man probably gave up because he realized he had the wrong person and felt stupid. Within minutes, they were back to their jokes, the fire crackling like nothing had happened. I sat there in silence, trying to convince myself they were right, that maybe I was just overreacting. But even then, deep down, I knew what I saw wasn't innocent. That man wasn't out for a stroll, and he definitely wasn't approaching me by mistake. It's been years since that night, but it still sticks with me. I carry pepper spray and a personal alarm everywhere I go now, because once you experience something like that, you never forget how fast things can turn dangerous. Back in my late teens and early 20s, I spent a lot of time working at summer camps and outdoor education centers across Canada. Most of those seasons were in Ontario, but I did a short stint out west too. By then, I had years of camping, canoeing, and long leadership trips under my belt. So when I got my first chance to lead a group of teenage girls on a 2-week canoe trip through the Temagami region, I felt prepared. Nervous, sure, but ready. Temagami is this gorgeous stretch of lakes and forests tucked between Sudbury, Timmins, and North Bay. It's full of winding canoe routes, long portages, quiet islands, and some of the most breathtaking sunrises you'll ever see. The group I had with me was doing a classic route, starting around Whitefish Falls and ending 2 weeks later near Highway 11. We had the usual scrapes, blisters, and sunburns, but nothing out of the ordinary. By the time we were on the second to last night, the trip felt like it had gone by smoothly. That evening, we set up camp on the shore of a small island in Bear Lake. It was one of those free campsites, not an official park site with a fire pit or picnic table, just a patch of ground big enough for a few tents. Across the water, you could see the main island where most of the Bear Island First Nation community lives, but our spot felt pretty isolated. We ate, cleaned up, and went to bed early since we had a long paddle the next morning. Around 11 at night, I woke up to the low growl of a boat motor. At first I brushed it off. People used boats all the time out there. But it struck me as odd because it was late, and everything had been quiet for hours. The engine cut out not far from shore, and that's when I started hearing voices. A man and a woman, loud, angry, practically shouting over each other. I couldn't make out the words, but the fight carried clear across the lake. Then the woman screamed. It wasn't a startled sound. It was sharp, long, and terrified. Right after, there was a splash, and then nothing. The silence was heavier than the yelling had been. I froze. My first thought was that I didn't want the girls to wake up, but I heard them whispering nervously inside their tent almost immediately. I was about to unzip my fly to check the water when everything around me lit up like a spotlight. A powerful beam swept across my tent, held for a moment, then shifted over to where the girls were sleeping. I whispered for them to keep still, my voice as calm as I could make it, even though my stomach was twisting. The light moved back to me, then back to them again, slow and deliberate. It went on like that for minutes that felt stretched thin, though in reality it probably wasn't more than 5. Then, just as suddenly, the beam snapped off and the boat engine roared back to life. The sound faded across the lake until it was gone. I stayed awake with the satellite phone in my lap, dialing the camp director as soon as I felt safe. He gave me the number for the local police detachment, and I relayed everything we'd heard and seen. They told me they'd forward it to the Bear Island Police, and that was the end of the call. None of us slept properly after that. At first light, I took a canoe out and searched the shoreline, half expecting to find someone who had managed to swim to land, or even debris floating. But the water was clear and still. Nothing. The girls didn't want to stay another night out there, and truthfully, neither did I. We cut the trip short and paddled straight to our pickup point a day ahead of schedule. Nobody said much on the way out, but I could tell we were all running the same thoughts in our heads. What had we just witnessed? And what would have happened if we'd made a sound when that light was on us? Years have passed, and I still replay it. When I've shared the story, plenty of people have been skeptical, like maybe I misheard or misinterpreted things. But that scream, the splash, and the way that light searched over our tents, there's no mistaking those. The scariest part is knowing there are dozens of cases of missing women in northern communities that never get solved or even properly reported. What we stumbled across that night might have been one of them. This happened just a week ago, and it's still stuck in my head. My parents drove me and my brother out to the campground with our two cousins and their dad, and because the girls refused to sleep in tents, we rented two little cabins right next to each other, so the whole crew could be near one another, which was perfect for us kids, because those cabins felt like our own little fortress. We rolled in Friday afternoon, hiked a bit, cooked on the grill, and did all the normal camping stuff until night. And the first shower run was totally uneventful because it was still light out, and my 17-year-old cousin drove the four of us, me, 14, my other cousin, 14, my brother, 13, and herself, over to the facilities. Everything felt fine and boring in that normal way that makes you grateful for boring nights. Saturday night was different because we stayed by the fire later and waited until about 9 to walk to the showers, which is basically walking into a tunnel of absolute black with only your phone flash to guide you. The shower building has 2 rows of 4 stalls facing each other, and we split up so the 3 of us kids could be close together with our brother and I taking the end stalls, which made sense in the dark and felt safer than wandering around alone. We were halfway through rinsing off when someone knocked on my stall door hard enough to make me yell that someone was in there, and I didn't hear an answer. Just the faint echo of knocking from other doors. I thought maybe someone was just being an idiot and moved on with drying off. A few minutes later, my brother stepped out and told me he'd been waiting because it felt creepy outside, which I agreed with. And then we both noticed a car parked where there hadn't been one before, sitting with its lights off but close enough that you could make out its shape in the dim. A moment after that, another stall opened on the opposite row, and out came a man and a woman, both wearing black, both dripping like they'd just used the showers. But their hair looked perfectly dry and styled, like they'd stepped out of a salon rather than a wet stall. We waved because we were trying to act casual and not make the situation weird, and the woman laughed this loud, kind of throatier laugh that made my skin clench. They walked toward their car slowly, and I noticed the driver glance at us like he was sizing where we sat in the parking lot. Then the woman kept looking back at me with this blank stare that didn't feel like curiosity, and didn't feel friendly either. We told our cousin what we'd just seen as soon as she came out, and by the time we finished explaining, the pair was already backing out and pulling away, but they kept looking at us in the rearview mirror like we were a scene in the headlights. It hit us at once that knocking on all the stall doors while people were inside made no sense, unless whoever did it wanted to see if adults would answer, which suddenly made the whole encounter feel deliberate and predatory, instead of random and weird. The showers are loud from outside with water running and tiles echoing, so anyone standing out there would have known people were inside, which suggested that the knocking was a test to check for an adult presence before deciding whether to try something else. We all scrambled into the car, and my cousin drove us slowly back to the cabins, every one of us quiet and tense, each of us replaying the woman's laugh and the way both of them had watched us leave like it was a slow, calculated thing. We didn't tell our parents that night because kids don't want to freak out grown-ups, and because part of me felt embarrassed for being scared. But we talked about it for hours once the lights were off and the cabin was quiet. The consensus between us was that the pair saw my little brother as an easy target and knocked to check if an adult would show up, and they left because the other showers weren't clearing quickly enough, or because they realized it wasn't worth the risk. That thought made me feel sick to my stomach, because the whole exchange could have been a setup, and one small decision could have led to something awful. Since then, I've been replaying little details, wondering if we noticed anything else we should have, and hoping that whatever those people were looking for, they didn't find at that campground that night.